Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. If you're like me, you have a ton of unfinished models and abandoned projects lying around. These Nurgle models were sitting on my desk for a long time, and I wanted to paint them up quickly. One of the quickest ways to get your army on the battlefield is with oil paints, and they're a lot less intimidating than you may think. In the first half of the video, we'll use contrast to paint some simple base coats on the models. In the second half, we'll apply an oil wash, talk about the materials and the process, and then add some finishing touches. So let's grab our brushes and get started. Let's start off with a Zenithal style undercoat. I prefer more of a subtle Zenithal undercoat, so I like to start with a household gray primer in a can, followed by a spray of white acrylic from my airbrush. A lot of painters start with black, but I think that makes the shadows too dark. And besides, the oil wash is going to darken those shadows anyway. After spraying the models with a layer of solid gray primer, I diluted white acrylic paint with an equal amount of water and then sprayed a few layers on the model with my airbrush, focusing on the top and sides. You can spray it as heavy or as light as you want, and you can make the lighting effect more pronounced or go for more of a solid white finish. The white layer is looking good to me, so I think I'm going to stop here. The underside is a medium to light gray, and it blends up to a bright white on the top. This subtle zenithal effect will help create more natural shading and highlights on the model when we apply transparent paints over the top of it. I generally try to work from light to dark with contrast paints, so I'm going to start with the skin areas first. I put a few different contrast paints on my palette: Plaguebearer Flesh, Dark Oath Flesh, and Magos Purple. I want the skin to have a sickly kind of look, with a putrid green kind of color in some areas, blending to a bruised purple kind of tone in other areas. I'm just hopping between colors and not thinking too much about it. I find a tapping kind of brush stroke is the most effective way to blend the wet paint. Work on one section at a time, and look for any areas where the paint is pooling. Then use the brush to soak up any excess paint as needed. I'm not too concerned about getting dark shadows, since the oil wash will take care of that later. With the first layers of color applied, I went back with Plaguebearer Flesh and Magos Purple, and I painted a second layer in a few areas to deepen the color. I'm not painting over everything here. I'm mostly looking for anywhere the first layer of color looks interesting, and adding an extra layer to reinforce the color. I used the same kind of tapping motion to blend out the edge of the paint, but don't worry too much about blending. The oil wash is going to cover up a lot of this. I painted the spikes, horns, and a few other details next with Skeleton Horde. Next I painted the armor with Militarum Green. The Blight drone has some larger sections of armor, and I find it easiest to use plenty of paint and start from the top. I worked my way down, and rather than going side to side with the brush, I prefer to use short, quick marks, and using a tapping kind of brush stroke. Let gravity do some of the work too, and the paint will slowly flow downwards. Use the brush to soak up any excess paint from above, and use the tapping brush marks to erase any uneven areas. I'm not worried about paint getting on the armor trim, since I'll be covering those areas with opaque paint later, but I'm doing my best to avoid getting any paint on the skin, since that will be more difficult to touch up. Next I painted the cloth on the Plague Marines with the dark red mix from my Tyranid army. This is a mix of 3 parts Flesh Terrors red and 1 part Black Templar. I painted some of the other cloth next with Gryph-Charger Grey. I'm not worried if some of the other colors spilled on those areas earlier. I won't bother painting it white first. Some of those stains might not even show up later in the process once the oil wash is added. But if they're still visible, I'll embrace the mistakes and turn those spots into stains or blood splatters. I painted some of the other cloth on the Poxwalkers with Magmadroth Flame. I painted Black Templar on the leather straps, pouches, and boots. Next I painted all the hoses with gray number 2 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use Eshin Gray instead. I painted all the steel areas next with Iron Hand steel, and after the first layer dries, you may want to paint a second for a bright, even finish. Next I picked out the armor trim, coils, icons, and other small details with Runelord brass. I painted Bonewhite on any of the spikes and horns that I missed, along with the fly wings and the poxwalker's teeth. Then I painted some Black Templar on the flies. The drone has some ooze on it, and I painted that with Moot Green. I'm not too worried about the blending on the edge, because the oil wash will cover up most of it. The poxwalkers have lots of maggots crawling on them, and I painted those with Genestealer purple. All the base coats are done and the models are ready for the oil wash, so let's go over the materials. Oil paint can get messy, so make sure you protect your work surface with craft paper, newspaper, or cardboard. You'll also want some rubber gloves to keep your hands clean. You'll need some sort of palette with a well for mixing the paint. I like using these metal mixing palettes because they're easy to clean. You'll also need some old brushes. Use brushes that you don't care about, because the oil paint will ruin them. This isn't completely necessary, but I find it useful. Liquin is an alkyd medium that speeds up the drying time of oil paint. I like to mix a small amount into the paint, and it can make the paint dry overnight rather than a couple days. There are tons of different brands and colors of oil paint. I'll be using Mars Black and Burnt Umber. A mix of these two colors is really close to the acrylic wash I normally use on my models. Any brand of oil paint should be fine, either artist grade or student grade. Just make sure it's real oil paint and not water mixable oils. The other thing you'll need is paint thinner or mineral spirits. Gamsol is ultra refined and it really has no odor. Other brands say odorless, but they still smell, and they'll give me a bad headache. I don't have that problem with Gamsol. Mineral spirits is extremely hazardous to the environment, and it should be disposed of properly. Don't ever put it down the drain or pour it on the ground outside. The good thing is it can be reused almost indefinitely, and I have a 3-jar system for getting the most out of it. I have a small jar for rinsing my brushes, a jar for backup clean mineral spirits, and a jar for the sludge. As you clean your brushes, the pigment gets dispersed into the paint thinner, and it will settle to the bottom of the jar overnight, and it's really easy to cycle everything. First, I'll pour off the clear mineral spirits into the clean jar. Sometimes it can be slightly discolored, but it's still perfectly usable. Then I'll stir up the pigment sludge from the bottom and pour that into the sludge jar, using some of the clear thinner to rinse it as needed. Once the sludge jar fills up, I'll pour the clear thinner off the top of it and take the remaining sludge to my city's hazardous waste collection. I like to put a small amount of liquid and paint on spare palettes, and then I'll grab a little bit of each. I mixed about equal parts, and then I diluted it with plenty of mineral spirits. I tested the mix on a scrap of paper, and I'd like it to be more on the brown side, so I added some more burnt umber to the mix. Once the color looks right to you, it's time to start painting it on the models. Use an old brush and work the paint into all the crevices. I'll use the first couple brush strokes to judge the strength of the paint, and whether or not I need to dilute it more. We're going to remove some of the paint later, so it should look a little darker than you want the finished product to be. If the paint looks too dark, add some more mineral spirits, and if it's too runny, add some more oil paint to the mix. You want to allow some of the paint to pool, but not too much, otherwise it'll take forever to dry. If you have too much mineral spirits in the mix and it pools too much, The pigment can separate and leave some odd surface markings as it dries. Once the washes are applied, set the models aside for a couple hours and allow the mineral spirits to evaporate. Oil paints themselves don't dry by evaporation. They dry because the oil oxidizes with the air, and that can take a couple days. So in an hour or two, once the mineral spirits evaporates, the paint will seem dry to the touch, but it can be reactivated with mineral spirits. And that's exactly what we're going to do, and remove some paint from the raised areas, which will effectively give us some highlights on the model. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, please consider Patreon or a YouTube channel membership. We have some perks including a Discord server, printer-friendly PDF files of our new recipe cards, and early access to videos. There are a few different options for removing the paint. My favorites are cotton swabs and pieces of fabric from an old t-shirt. Makeup sponges are also popular, but I don't have any of those right now. I like to use the fabric on larger models, like the drone. I'll fold up the piece of fabric into a point, dip it in the mineral spirits, and tap it a couple times on a paper towel to drain off some of the excess spirits. Then carefully rub the surface of the model to remove the oil paint. The amount you remove is up to you. I'd suggest removing more paint near the top of the model and the center of interest, and remove less paint on the bottom and underside to emphasize the Zenithal highlighting effect. Make sure to use a light touch, because the contrast base coats are pretty thin, and if you scrub the model too hard, you risk rubbing off the base coats. You can use the t-shirt fabric on small models too, but usually I prefer a cotton swab. Dip it in the mineral spirits, dab it on a paper towel, and then gently rub the model's surface. One thing to watch out for is the cotton fibers can come off, especially on models with lots of spikes and sharp parts. So I'll switch to a new cotton swab after 2 or 3 models. If any cotton fibers stick to the model, just leave them for now and you can pull them off with tweezers later. I let the models dry overnight, and now I need to spray them with varnish before I can paint over them. I prefer using a canned varnish over an oil-washed surface. You could use an acrylic varnish with an airbrush, but in my experience it doesn't adhere to the surface as well as an enamel canned varnish does. My goal with these models is to get them finished quickly, and I don't want to spend too much time adding details. So I'm going to add just a few simple things and try to strike a nice balance between speed and quality. The first thing I want to do is add some rust to the metal and the green armor. I diluted Mournfang brown with about 3 parts water, and with very little paint on an old brush, I stippled some paint here and there. I think it's a good way to add extra color to the models, especially on the green armor. This is also a good opportunity to cover up any areas where the oil wash dried unevenly. Maybe you missed a spot, or maybe it dried too dark. I think the key here is to use an old brush. The worse condition it's in, the better, because it'll make some random looking marks and textures. Next I repeated the same process with Troll Slayer Orange, diluted with a few parts water. This color is a lot brighter, so I'm applying this layer very sparingly. I think a little will go a long way. I added some oxidation to the brass areas next in the same kind of way, using an old brush and a turquoise paint diluted with water. Next I highlighted the green goo with moot green. On such dark and gritty models, I think a few really bright colors make them look more interesting, so I think it's worth spending a little extra time. Speaking of bright colors, I decided to paint some really bright yellow on the Poxwalker's eyes and boils. I painted a few on each model, leaving a dark outline around them. On the smaller boils, I found I could get away with just one layer of paint, but the larger ones ended up needing a second layer. I also painted the eye lenses on the drone and plague marine, as well as the plasma coils. I think orange would be a nice color for the eye lenses and plasma gun, so I shaded those with Magma Droth Flame, diluted with about 2 parts contrast medium. While the paint was still wet on the eye lens, I rinsed the brush, wiped it off on a paper towel, and used the clean brush to remove some of the paint from the center. Finally, I attached the fans to the drone with some super glue. Since I want these models done quickly, I'm going to go with my standard, simple kind of basing: wood glue, coarse gravel, and fine sand. I painted the sand with a base coat of thinned Rhinox hide, dry brushed with Steel Legion drab, followed by a dry brush of Krieg khaki. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, shaded with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, and then I painted the edge of the base with Steel Legion drab. Finally, I added patches of dead static grass with super glue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our supporters here on YouTube and Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below or follow the Patreon link in the video description. Thank you. It's a good feeling when I can move some models from the unpainted pile of shame onto the display shelf. Usually I prefer a very bright, clean style of painting, but I think this gritty, dark style really fits with Nurgle. Do you ever change up your painting style to fit the theme of the models? And what about your unpainted pile of shame? What's your strategy for painting it all? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. And until next time, happy painting.